So we've talked a lot about some of the potential negative impacts of different forms of agriculture. Talked about the use of pesticides and herbicides. Talked about practices of tilling the soil, releasing carbon from the soil. Talked about soil erosion. Talked about impacts from animal agriculture and CAFOs. So now we're going to shift and talk about, well, what are some practices that can be used that are more sustainable, that have less negative impacts on the environment? So this as a whole we would call sustainable agricultural practices. And there's a whole variety of different ways of raising food, crops, and animals that can significantly reduce their impacts on the environment. Okay? So sustainable agriculture can be thought as using various agricultural techniques to enhance soil quality, minimize the use of non-renewable resources, and still allow for economic viability for the farmer and production of food. Oftentimes, these types of sustainable agriculture might be more labor intensive, they may be more expensive, they may be less efficient than industrialized agriculture. And so that's one of the reasons why they are not widespread. You can buy food products, you can buy fruits and vegetables and meat from areas where they are raised sustainably, but you have to look for it. You have to work to find these products, and oftentimes you have to pay more to get products that are raised sustainably. And so some of the practices that are included in sustainable agriculture, methods of conserving soil to prevent erosion, call that soil conservation farming, rotational grazing of animals, using integrated pest management, as well as other tools in farming. And so there's a shift, the shift into, this is sometimes also called regenerative agriculture, in which people that are raising crops are trying to shift models from this left side of the diagram, from agriculture which disturbs the soil, which competes with nature, which encourages monocultures of a single crop, and shifting into a model of agriculture that provides diversity of plant and animal life, that protects soil, that works with nature to produce food products. And that is what we would call regenerative agriculture. So here are some tools that are sometimes used for soil conservation. Soil conservation is about maintaining soil health, maintaining soil structure, maintaining fertility of the soil and not exhausting the soil of nutrients, preventing soil erosion. Those are all things included under this soil conservation method. So I'll just briefly mention a few of these. This is an example of contour plowing. If farm is put into crops and it's in an area that has hills or has a slope, one thing that can happen is if you just sort of plant and till the soil up and over the hill, it can lead to large amounts of soil erosion. The soil from the top of the hill basically ends up at the bottom of the hill, and then the top of the hill is devoid of topsoil. Contour plowing, rather than plowing straight up and over the hill, plows in parallel to the geographic contours, and this drastically reduces the amount of soil erosion in these types of agriculture in hilly areas. Another method of farming in hilly areas is terrace farming, or terracing, as you see in this picture. This is sort of taking a hillside and reshaping it so you have these beds of flat areas. And again, this reduces soil and wind erosion. It allows for more of the land area to be productive using this terracing method. These are windbreaks. So this is a field of maybe corn, but planted are trees or shrubs, and what that does is as the wind blows, these sort of act as a break, sort of like you're hiding behind somebody when the wind's blowing really, really strongly to block the wind. Well, these rows of trees or shrubs help prevent the wind from eroding the soil in these fields. And so windbreaks can be useful, especially in areas that are susceptible to high winds. Perennial crops are using crops that don't need to be planted annually, okay, but they grow back year after year, so they're planted and then tended, and they don't need to be replanted year after year. There's also a type of agriculture that does not turn over the soil each year. Okay, we talked about tilling or plowing the soil as damaging soil structure and releasing carbon into the atmosphere. No-till agriculture leaves the residue of the crops after they're harvested on the field. And that also allows for some of those nutrients that are in those crop residues to slowly be returned back into the soil. And rather than completely turning over the soil, in no-till agriculture, we often have specialized equipment that just inserts seeds or seedlings into the ground without turning over the soil, plowing a trench and planting seeds. It sort of injects seeds into the ground so the soil doesn't have to be turned over. No-till agriculture can have a significant impact on carbon emissions. But because tilling the soil does reduce weeds from growing, using no-till agriculture might sometimes require a greater use of pesticides, so it's a little bit of a trade-off. To maintain soil fertility, some other methods are crop rotation, which means rather than planting, say, corn in a specific field year after year, it's rotated. Okay, that's crop rotation, because different plants, as we saw in our soil lab, need different nutrients, different amounts of nutrients from the soil. And so by rotating which plants are in which areas, you can make sure that a single plant is not exhausting the soil of a specific nutrient. You could also plant legumes or other nitrogen-fixing plants. So if you are growing corn one year, the next year maybe you plant beans, because we know beans are nitrogen-fixing plants and they live in association with nitrogen-fixing bacteria. So growing those beans the next season further enriches the soil with nitrogen, allowing for soil fertility to be maintained. We can see some traditional methods of rotating crops season after season as a part of this crop rotation method of agriculture. Interplanting is a method of planting when you don't plant huge fields of a single crop, but you plant several crops within the same field. We can see in this row we have corn, these tall plants. You have soybeans, here are these green layers, and then oats in this other layer. And so now you've separated the field into multiple compartments. One of the benefits of interplanting is that like an insect pest of the corn, may be held into a specific area and not spread from one row to another. Okay, it also allows you to plant crops together that have positive interactions together. And finally, the use of green manure, which is the waste products or the crop residues left over after the harvest of the usable parts of the plant, that can be composted, can be added back to the soil, can be left to lay on the land so that it returns back the nutrients that are held within that tissue as it decomposes. It also adds organic material to that top layer of soil. And also limestone, for example, can allow for spreading limestone, can increase soil pH, which is beneficial for certain plants. It can also help increase soil fertility. I'm sure you've heard of organic farming, and organic farming is a way of raising crops or animals with specific intentions, with certain restrictions. Organic farming uses is a method which doesn't use pesticides, synthetic fertilizer, genetically modified organisms, antibiotics, or hormones. And so if a farm is certified organic, they are inspected, they're given the ability to use the organic word in their products. And so if you go to a grocery store and you buy organic cucumbers, then they've been certified, and you know that they're not using synthetic fertilizers or pesticides to grow those cucumbers. And organic farming can significantly reduce the environmental impacts of agriculture by building healthy soil, by reducing nutrient runoff, by reducing antibiotic and pesticide pollution. All of those things are improved when organic methods of farming are used. And organic farming uses a variety of techniques that we've already talked about to raise crops. Of course, they need fertilizers, but instead of synthetic fertilizer, they likely use green manure or composted animal manure, using integrated pest management rather than pesticides to control pests. There's lots of techniques that have to be used in order to effectively raise crops organically. You could also use a type of grazing called rotational grazing to raise livestock without overgrazing the land. And basically in rotational grazing, the pasture land is split into sections, and then animals are purposefully moved from one pasture to another in a rotation that allows for the regeneration of the plants in those pastures to keep them viable and usable. And so you can see some of the details here. This is like the layout of a hypothetical rotational grazing operation where you break a large pasture into several pastures, and then you move the cows feed and graze in one, and then they're eventually moved to another and another. And so this allows animals to be more spread out. There's less disease spread amongst them, means you need less antibiotics. Also, you can have sort of a more sustainable farm when the cows can be moved, the cattle can be moved from area to area. And it also allows the cattle to eat their natural diet of grasses rather than being fed grain. And so this method of grazing animals is very beneficial over overgrazing or CAFO food production. And finally, the last thing is I did want to mention, we have in our area several types of agricultural models that are different than going to the grocery store and buying groceries and our produce and meats and so forth. And so you may have heard of a CSA, and I think I probably talked about it in class before. A community-supported agriculture is when usually a small farm sells shares, a certain number of shares to the public, and you pay a certain amount at the beginning of the season. And then the farm uses that money to invest in the farm and then raises crops, and each week you go and you get your vegetables. And what you get is going to be dependent on the weather, the climate, on what the farm has decided to grow, and you are willing to accept that. And the farm is benefiting by they have a reliable source of income. They know each year they're going to get X number of dollars from the shares that they're selling that they can use to plan and prepare for the upcoming season, rather than growing crops and then trying to sell them at the market or sell them to large distributors, where the amount of money you're going to get for those crops is going to be unknown, and it's less consistent from year to year. And so there's plenty of places you can get a CSA share around here that use this model of agriculture. For example, the one we use, Old Path Farms, they raise their crops organically, and we go each week, we get a box of vegetables. Sometimes they're things we've never had before, but there's lots of things that we do enjoy as well in there, and it forces us to try new things, and we're supporting local agriculture in a sustainable manner.